Who let him in? Catherine Whitmore's voice sliced clean through the polished stillness of the executive boardroom, sharp enough to turn every head in unison, and for a second, even the soft hum of the ceiling vents seemed to hesitate, like the air itself wasn't sure it should keep moving. The long obsidian table stretched across the room like a mirror of authority, reflecting tailored suits, silver cufflinks, and the quiet arrogance of people who were used to being the most important presence wherever they sat. And right at the head of that table, the chair, wide-backed, leather, unmistakably the seat of command, stood slightly pulled out, claimed without hesitation by Catherine as she settled into it with the ease of someone who believed the world rearranged itself around her decisions. Across the room, near the wall where the projector light cast a pale rectangle against a glass panel, stood a man most of them hadn't noticed when they first walked in. A black man in a simple charcoal suit, no flash, no insignia, just a clean line of fabric and a stillness that didn't beg for attention, didn't demand it, but also didn't shrink from the room. His badge clipped neatly at his waist reading Visitor, the kind of label that told everyone exactly how much space he was allowed to take up, which wasn't much. Catherine's eyes lingered on him for a fraction longer than necessary, her lips tightening ever so slightly, as if something about his presence disrupted the symmetry she expected, and she tilted her head, not curious, not confused, just mildly inconvenienced, like spotting a smudge on an otherwise flawless surface. "We're about to begin," she said, her tone measured but edged with dismissal, the kind that didn't need to raise volume to establish hierarchy. "So unless you're here to fix something, you should step out." And a few quiet chuckles followed, low and polite, the kind people offered when they weren't sure if they were witnessing a joke or a boundary being drawn. The man didn't move immediately, didn't flinch, didn't even glance around for support. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady, taking in the room as if he were memorizing it rather than reacting to it. And for a brief second, the reflection of the city skyline behind him, steel and glass rising against a pale morning sky, framed him in a way that didn't quite match the role everyone had already assigned him. A junior associate near the far end adjusted his tablet, avoiding eye contact. Another executive leaned back slightly, watching with mild amusement, and someone near Catherine whispered something under their breath that earned a restrained smile. "Seriously," Catherine added, her fingers tapping once against the armrest of the chair, a soft, controlled sound that still carried across the table. "We don't have time for confusion today." And she reached forward to straighten the neatly stacked documents in front of her, aligning the edges with precise, practiced movements, signaling that whatever, or whoever, didn't belong would be handled quickly and without disruption. The man's gaze shifted then, not toward her, but toward the head of the table itself, toward the seat she now occupied, and there was no tension in his posture, no visible challenge, just a quiet observation, like someone noticing a detail others had overlooked. And the light from the projector flickered slightly, casting a faint ripple across his face before stabilizing again. Somewhere behind him, the glass door clicked softly as it settled into place, sealing the room in a silence that felt just a fraction heavier than before, the kind that pressed gently against the edges of a moment, waiting to see which direction it would tip. And in that suspended breath between dismissal and response, between assumption and truth, nothing moved, except the subtle rise and fall of the man's chest as he took in a slow, measured breath, as if time, for him, wasn't something that needed to be rushed. Marcus Reed had arrived 40 minutes early, long before the elevators began releasing waves of executives in tailored suits and polished shoes that clicked with quiet confidence across the marble floors, long before the assistant placed bottled water at every seat with labels turned outward like small details that mattered more than they seemed, and long before Catherine Whitmore walked in as if the room had been waiting specifically for her. He had stood alone at the head of the table then, not sitting, just observing, his fingers lightly grazing the back of the leather chair that now held her, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath his palm as the city outside stretched wide through the glass walls, 12 stories of steel and sunlight reflecting a skyline that never paused for anyone. And he had taken a slow breath, steady and grounded, the kind of breath that did not belong to someone uncertain, but to someone who had learned patience the hard way. through rooms where voices were louder than truth and assumptions moved faster than facts. His suit was clean but understated, no designer label announcing itself, no watch flashing status, just a quiet precision in how everything fit, as if he understood that presence did not always need decoration. And when the first employees began to enter, they barely noticed him, their eyes sliding past as if he were part of the background, a technician, a support staff member, someone temporary, someone who did not belong to the decisions being made in that room. And Marcus had not corrected them, not because he could not, but because he chose not to, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it wanted to. He had adjusted the presentation screen when it flickered once, a small glitch that drew a quick glance from a junior analyst who muttered a distracted thank you before returning to his notes, and Marcus had nodded slightly, his movements efficient, practiced, the kind that suggested he understood systems far beyond what anyone in the room assumed. And still, he remained near the edge, near the wall, where the light from the projector washed over him in soft pulses, turning his reflection faint against the glass. When Catherine entered, the energy shifted instantly. Conversations cut short, chairs pulled straighter, and attention aligned toward her like metal drawn to a magnet. And Marcus had watched without expression, noting the rhythm of authority in her stride, the way she did not look for permission to take space, but claimed it as if it were already hers. And when she chose the seat at the head of the table without hesitation, he did not step forward, did not interrupt. He simply observed, because he had seen this before, not the exact room, not the exact faces, but the pattern, the assumption, the quiet dismissal that came before recognition. Now, as her voice settled into the room, and the faint echo of her earlier questions still lingered in the air, Marcus remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, posture steady, his gaze moving once more to the chair she occupied, not with irritation, not with urgency, but with a calm certainty that did not need to announce itself. And as the city light shifted slightly behind him, catching the edge of his profile, there was something in his stillness that did not match the role everyone had already decided for him, something that did not bend under the weight of their assumptions, something that waited quietly for the moment when the room would have no choice but to see what it had overlooked. Catherine Whitmore leaned back slightly into the leather chair, her posture effortless yet deliberate, as if every inch of space she occupied had already been measured and claimed long before she entered the room, her fingers resting lightly on the polished surface of the table while her eyes moved across the executives seated around her, not searching for approval but confirming it, collecting silent acknowledgments in the form of nods, attentive gazes, and the subtle shift of bodies aligning toward her presence. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same controlled precision, smooth but edged with authority that did not invite interruption. "Let us not waste time," she said, her tone calm, yet final, as if the meeting had already begun the moment she sat down. And a few people responded immediately, flipping open folders, tapping on tablets, preparing themselves to follow her lead without question. To Catherine, rooms like this had always followed a pattern, a predictable structure where influence defined reality, where ownership was assumed through confidence and reinforced by silence. And she had built her reputation inside spaces exactly like this one, boardrooms wrapped in glass and skyline views, where decisions shaped companies and companies shaped lives. And she had learned early that hesitation was a weakness these rooms punished quickly. So she never hesitated, not when she spoke, not when she chose her seat, and certainly not when she decided who belonged and who did not. Her gaze flicked once more toward Marcus, still standing near the wall, and there was a faint narrowing of her eyes, not quite irritation, more like dismissal solidifying into certainty, and she gestured vaguely toward the back of the room without fully turning her head. "If you are here for technical support, stay out of the way," she added, her words light enough to pass as instruction, but firm enough to define a boundary. And again, a few quiet smiles appeared around the table, subtle, restrained, the kind that did not challenge her authority but quietly reinforced it. One of the senior partners, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a navy suit tailored to exact proportions, leaned forward slightly, clearing his throat as if preparing to speak. But even he paused for half a second, measuring the room, measuring her, before proceeding. "We have the acquisition documents ready," he said, his voice respectful, careful, and Catherine nodded once, granting him permission to continue, her attention already shifting back to the center of the table where the neatly arranged documents reflected the overhead lights in clean, sharp lines. Marcus remained still, his presence unchanged, but his eyes moved with quiet precision, observing the flow of control as it settled into place, noting the way voices adjusted around Catherine, how even seasoned executives recalibrated their tone when addressing her, and there was no tension in his expression, no visible reaction to the role she had assigned him, only a steady awareness, as if he were watching a scene unfold that he had already read before. The faint hum of the projector filled the silence between exchanges, and a slide flickered briefly before stabilizing again, drawing a quick glance from Catherine, who tapped her finger once against the table, a subtle signal of impatience, and Marcus stepped forward just enough to adjust the alignment of the screen, his movement smooth, unhurried, correcting the distortion with a small, precise touch, and for a moment, the image snapped into perfect clarity, the text sharp, the numbers aligned, and the room seemed to settle more comfortably into its rhythm. "Good," Catherine said without looking at him, already turning her attention back to the discussion, as if the correction had been expected, as if his role had been fulfilled exactly as she had defined it, and the meeting continued, voices layering over one another in measured tones, strategies unfolding, decisions forming, all of it moving forward under the assumption that control was firmly in her hands, that the structure of the room was fixed, that every person in it had already been placed in their proper position, and yet, just beyond that assumption, standing quietly at the edge of the light, Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, his presence unchanged, his silence unbroken, holding within it a certainty that had not yet been spoken, but would not remain hidden for much longer. The discussion moved forward with a rhythm that felt rehearsed, numbers projected across the screen, bullet points aligning neatly in columns, voices rising and falling in controlled turns, and Catherine Whitmore guided it all with the subtle authority of someone who believed she was not just part of the process but the center of it, her fingers occasionally tapping the table in soft, deliberate beats that signaled when to pause, when to continue, when to shift direction, and each time someone spoke, they glanced at her, not directly asking for approval, but waiting for it all the same. Marcus Reed watched the flow without interruption, his position unchanged, yet his attention sharpened as the presentation advanced to the financial projections, a series of figures that scrolled across the screen in clean, confident lines, numbers that suggested stability, growth, and control, and for a moment, the room seemed fully convinced by what it saw, a quiet confidence settling over the executives as they nodded, some jotting notes, others leaning back with the ease of people who believed they were stepping into a successful outcome. Then, almost imperceptibly, Marcus stepped forward again, not enough to draw immediate attention, just enough to stand within the edge of the table's reflection, his gaze fixed on a specific line of data, and he tilted his head slightly, as if aligning what he saw with something already stored in his mind. Catherine did not look at him, but she noticed the movement, her eyes flicking briefly in his direction before returning to the screen, and there was a faint tightening in her expression, a silent question forming not out of curiosity, but out of irritation at the disruption of her controlled environment. The presenter, a young analyst with a steady voice, continued explaining the projections, pointing to a section that outlined expected returns over the next 18 months, and as he spoke, Marcus took one more small step forward, his voice calm, even, cutting through the air without raising itself. "That projection assumes a fixed liability structure," he said, and the room shifted instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the change to be felt. Conversations halted mid-thought, pens paused above paper, and several heads turned toward him with expressions that ranged from confusion to mild annoyance. The analyst blinked, thrown off rhythm, glancing instinctively toward Catherine as if waiting for her to dismiss the interruption, and Catherine's gaze settled on Marcus fully now, her posture straightening slightly, her tone controlled but edged with something firmer. "This is not your concern," she said, her words precise, each one placed carefully. We have already reviewed these numbers, and a few executives nodded in agreement, reinforcing her statement without speaking. Marcus did not react to the dismissal, did not step back, did not raise his voice. He simply continued, his tone unchanged. If the liability is not fixed, those returns do not hold. And he gestured subtly toward the screen, not dramatically, just enough to indicate the specific section he was referencing, and the analyst hesitated again, his confidence slipping for a fraction of a second as he looked down at his notes, then back at the projection. Catherine's fingers tapped the table once more, sharper this time, a quiet signal that control needed to be reasserted. "We are not revisiting settled points," she said, her voice carrying a finality that usually ended discussions before they began, and for a moment, the room seemed ready to move on, ready to dismiss the interruption as irrelevant. But something had already shifted, something small but undeniable, a thread of doubt weaving itself through the certainty that had filled the room just seconds before, and Marcus stood there, calm, unmoved, his presence no longer blending into the background quite as easily, his words lingering in the air like a question no one had expected to be asked. And as the screen continued to glow with numbers that now seemed just a little less solid, the room hovered on the edge of a realization it had not yet fully reached. The room did not recover immediately, not fully, because even though Catherine Whitmore had spoken with certainty, even though her tone had drawn a clear boundary meant to close the moment, something in Marcus Reed's words had already settled beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, like a small crack in glass that did not shatter the structure, yet changed the way light passed through it. And the analyst standing by the screen shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tightening around the remote as he glanced once more at the numbers he had presented with confidence just seconds before, his voice no longer as steady when he resumed. "The projections were based on the current contractual framework," he said, but the phrasing carried a hint of hesitation now, a subtle uncertainty that had not been there before. Catherine noticed it instantly, the slight falter, the shift in tone, and her expression sharpened, her posture straightening as if to reinforce control not just over the conversation but over the room itself. "Then proceed with the current framework," she said, her voice calm but firmer now, less patient, more directive, and she leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on the analyst in a way that left no room for deviation, and for a moment, it worked. The analyst nodded quickly, almost reflexively, turning back to the screen as if to move forward and leave the interruption behind. But Marcus did not step back, did not return to the wall. He remained where he was, his presence no longer peripheral, his voice entering the space again with the same calm precision. "It is not fixed," he said, not louder, not forceful, just clear, and this time, the silence that followed was heavier, more deliberate, as if the room itself paused to measure the weight of what had just been said. Catherine's hand stilled against the table, her fingers no longer tapping, and she turned her head fully toward him now, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in controlled irritation, the kind that came from being challenged in a space she considered fully under her command. "You are out of line," she said, each word measured, her tone no longer dismissive but corrective, as if she were placing him back into a role he had stepped outside of. And a few executives shifted in their seats, some glancing at one another, others lowering their eyes to their notes, unwilling to engage but unable to ignore the tension that had taken hold of the room. One of the senior partners cleared his throat again, quieter this time, as if unsure whether to intervene or remain silent, and the analyst hesitated, his thumb hovering over the remote, waiting for direction that now felt less certain than before. Marcus met Catherine's gaze without resistance, without challenge, simply holding it with a steadiness that did not escalate the moment, but did not retreat from it either. And he gestured once more toward the screen, a small, precise motion. "If you proceed with that assumption, the exposure increases beyond what is reflected here," he said, and the words landed differently this time, not as an interruption, but as a statement that demanded acknowledgement. And the analyst's eyes flickered again to the numbers, his confidence slipping further as he began to scan the lines more carefully, as if seeing them for the first time. Catherine exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried a hint of impatience, and she leaned back slightly, her posture shifting from immediate dismissal to something more calculated, as if reassessing the situation without conceding control. "This meeting is not open for speculation," she said, but the certainty in her voice had changed, just slightly, enough for those paying attention to notice, and across the table, one executive reached quietly for his tablet, pulling up the document Marcus had referenced, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled, and the faint glow of the screen reflected in his glasses as his expression shifted from neutral to focused. The room was no longer aligned as it had been moments before, the clean structure of authority beginning to bend under the weight of an uninvited truth, and Marcus remained exactly where he stood, composed, steady, his voice no longer needed for the moment because the doubt he had introduced was already doing its work, moving silently through the room, changing the way every number on that screen was now being seen. The room did not move forward, not yet, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and even though no one spoke for a few seconds, the silence itself felt louder than any argument that could have followed, a thick, suspended stillness that pressed gently against the glass walls and settled into the polished surface of the table, where reflections of faces now looked slightly different, less certain, less aligned. Marcus Reed lowered his hand slowly after gesturing to the screen, not withdrawing from the moment, but allowing it to breathe, allowing the weight of what he had said to settle without forcing it further. And he took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space, his posture unchanged, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if he understood that the truth did not need to be repeated when it had already been heard. Catherine Whitmore did not speak immediately either, which in itself was unusual, her presence normally filling any pause with direction, with certainty, but now her fingers rested still against the table, her eyes fixed not on Marcus but on the projection, scanning the numbers again with a sharper focus, as if recalibrating her understanding without acknowledging that she was doing so, and the faint reflection of the data flickered across her expression, subtle but visible in the way her jaw tightened just slightly. One of the executives cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but as a reflex, a small human response to tension, and another shifted in his chair, the leather creaking faintly, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the quiet. The analyst standing by the screen adjusted his glasses, his eyes moving line by line now, no longer presenting but verifying, his earlier confidence replaced by careful scrutiny, and he tapped lightly on his tablet, pulling up additional details, the glow illuminating his face as his brows drew together, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to lean into that small action, waiting, watching, not openly, but collectively. Marcus remained still, his breathing slow and even, his attention no longer on the room as a whole, but on the unfolding realization within it, the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet recalculations happening behind composed expressions, and there was no satisfaction in his face, no hint of triumph, only a calm patience, as if he had seen this moment many times before, the moment when certainty began to loosen its grip. Catherine finally leaned forward again, but the movement was different now, less declarative, more measured, her hand reaching for one of the documents in front of her, flipping a page with precise control and the soft sound of paper sliding against paper cut through the silence with unexpected clarity, and she scanned a section quickly, her eyes moving with practiced speed. But this time, there was a pause, just a fraction longer than usual, as if a detail had caught her attention that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there all along but unnoticed. Across the table, another executive opened his laptop, the quiet click of the keyboard punctuating the stillness, and he began typing, pulling up the same data, cross-referencing, his expression shifting from passive observation to active engagement, and one by one, others followed in smaller ways, glances exchanged, screens activated, notes revisited, the room no longer unified under a single direction but branching into individual verification, each person quietly testing the foundation that had just been questioned. Marcus exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and for a brief moment, his gaze lifted toward the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching out in sharp lines and distant movement, a reminder of scale, of perspective, before returning to the room where everything had narrowed to this single point of tension, and still, He said nothing more, because he did not need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was working, unfolding, revealing. And as the numbers on the screen continued to glow with the same brightness they had before, they no longer held the same certainty, and the room, once so sure of its structure, now sat in a quiet, collective pause, waiting for something that had not yet been spoken but was already beginning to change everything. The shift did not arrive with a sudden sound or a dramatic interruption. It came quietly, almost respectfully, as the analyst standing near the screen finally spoke again. But this time his voice carried a different weight, stripped of earlier certainty and replaced with careful precision. "The liability clause is conditional," he said, his eyes still fixed on the data. And the words landed in the room like a soft but undeniable correction, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. And several heads turned at once, not toward Catherine, but toward the screen, toward the numbers that now seemed to rearrange themselves under a new understanding. Catherine Whitmore did not respond immediately, her gaze still on the document in front of her. But her stillness had changed, no longer the stillness of control, but the stillness of recalculation. Her fingers resting lightly against the paper as if anchoring her in a moment that was beginning to slip from its original shape. Across the table, the senior partner leaned forward again, this time without waiting, his voice lower, more cautious. "If that condition triggers, the exposure increases significantly," he said, and he glanced briefly toward Marcus. Not fully, not directly, but enough to acknowledge the source of the disruption that had now become a point of focus. Marcus remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, not claiming the moment, not pressing it forward, simply allowing the room to arrive at its own realization. And there was something in that restraint that made the silence between each new statement feel heavier, more deliberate. Catherine finally lifted her gaze from the document, her eyes moving slowly across the table, taking in the subtle shifts, the way attention had redistributed itself, the way the room was no longer aligned solely with her direction. And for a brief second, something unspoken passed through her expression, not confusion, not disbelief, but the recognition of a miscalculation, small but significant. "We will verify the clause," she said, her voice controlled, but the certainty that once defined it now carried a trace of caution, and she reached for her tablet, her movements precise, composed, as if maintaining the structure of authority even as it adjusted beneath her, and she began to scroll, her eyes scanning rapidly, searching for confirmation, for clarity, for control. The analyst nodded slightly, stepping back from the screen, giving space to the unfolding review, and the faint hum of the projector filled the room once more, a steady, neutral sound that contrasted with the quiet tension that had taken hold. Marcus took one step forward then, not abruptly, not to interrupt, but to align himself with the table, rather than the wall, his presence no longer peripheral, and he placed his hand lightly against the back of the chair at the head of the table. The same chair Catherine occupied, his touch subtle, almost incidental, but deliberate in its timing. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one questioned the movement, because the room was still processing something larger than position. Catherine's eyes lifted from her tablet at that exact moment, drawn not by his movement alone, but by the convergence of everything that had led to it. And she looked at him fully now, not as an inconvenience, not as a background figure, but as a presence that no longer fit the role she had assigned. And there was a pause, a fraction of time where the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, measuring, recalibrating. Marcus met her gaze calmly, without urgency, without challenge, and in that quiet exchange, the dynamic of the room shifted once more, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as if a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. And though no one had yet spoken the truth that now hovered just beneath the surface, it was already there, forming, undeniable, waiting only for the moment it would finally be said aloud. The silence did not break all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something inevitable finally reaching the surface, and Catherine Whitmore's gaze remained locked on Marcus Reed for a second longer than before, long enough for the shift to become undeniable, her posture still composed, but no longer unchallenged. And in that quiet moment, The faint sound of a notification echoed from the far end of the table as one of the executive's laptops refreshed, a soft chime that seemed insignificant until the man's expression changed, his eyes widening just slightly as he leaned closer to the screen, scrolling quickly, then stopping, his fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether to speak. Another executive noticed, leaning in, whispering something under his breath, and within seconds, that subtle ripple moved across the table, screens lighting up, documents being pulled, names and ownership structures surfacing in neat digital lines that now carried a different meaning. Catherine's attention shifted toward the movement, her eyes narrowing as she watched the reaction rather than the source, and she placed her tablet down slowly, deliberately, as if grounding herself before stepping into whatever was forming. "What is it?" she asked, her voice controlled. But the edge of certainty had softened into something more cautious. The senior partner cleared his throat again, but this time there was no hesitation, only a careful respect in his tone. "There has been an update to the ownership registry," he said, his words measured, and he turned his laptop slightly so that the screen faced her, the glow reflecting faintly against the polished surface of the table. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes scanning the display, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as she read, and for a moment, the room held its breath again, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that something had just crossed from uncertainty into fact. Marcus did not move, his hand still resting lightly on the back of the chair, his presence steady, his gaze calm. And when Catherine looked up from the screen, her eyes met his again, but this time, there was no dismissal in them, no assumption, only a quiet recalibration, a recognition that the roles in the room were no longer what she had believed. The senior partner spoke again, softer now, almost as if acknowledging something that required a different tone. "The majority stake was transferred last night," he said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, because everyone understood what they meant. Marcus stepped forward then, just one step, closing the distance between himself and the table, his hand leaving the chair as he placed it gently against the surface, his fingers resting flat, grounded, and he spoke for the first time since the realization had begun to take shape, his voice even, composed, carrying not authority imposed, but authority that simply existed. "The structure changed at midnight," he said, and he paused briefly, not for effect, but because the room was already listening, truly listening now, and then he added, "I approve the transfer." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it simply stated what was. Catherine remained still for a moment, her gaze steady on him, her posture composed but undeniably altered, and then, slowly, she rose from the chair, the movement controlled, deliberate, the soft sound of the leather shifting beneath her the only noise in the room. And as she stood, the space she had occupied changed. Instantly, no longer anchored by assumption, but opened by truth. Marcus did not rush to take the seat, did not reach for it immediately. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to settle fully, allowing the room to absorb what had already become clear. And around the table, no one spoke, no one questioned, because the structure had shifted in a way that required no further explanation. And in the quiet that followed, the balance of power did not need to be declared, it was already understood. No one moved to fill the space immediately after Catherine Whitmore stepped away from the chair, and for a moment, the room existed in a kind of quiet equilibrium, the kind that only comes after something irreversible has already happened, where every person present understands that the structure they walked into is no longer the one they are standing in now, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense with recognition, with recalibration, with the quiet acceptance of a truth that had revealed itself without force. Marcus Reed remained still for a second longer, his hand resting lightly against the table, his gaze steady but not searching, as if he was allowing the moment to settle not just around him, but within the room itself, giving it time to adjust, to breathe, to understand. And then, without urgency, without any gesture meant to claim attention, he reached for the chair and pulled it back slightly, the soft sound of leather shifting against the floor, carrying across the room with unexpected clarity, and he sat down, not heavily, not triumphantly, but with a calm precision that matched everything about him. His posture straight, grounded, as if he had always belonged there, as if the seat had simply been waiting for him to take it. Across the table, Catherine remained standing, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression composed but changed. The sharp certainty that had once defined her now softened into something quieter, more reflective, and she looked at Marcus, not with resistance, not with defiance, but with a measured acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The executives around the table adjusted subtly, some straightening their posture, others closing their laptops halfway as if resetting their focus, and one by one, their attention aligned again. But this time, it did not center on assumption. It centered on reality, on the shift that had already taken place. Marcus placed his hands lightly on the table, his fingers relaxed, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm clarity it had held from the beginning, steady, unforced. "Let us review the structure again," he said, and there was no edge in his tone, no need to assert authority through volume or command, because the room no longer required it. The authority was already understood, already accepted. The analyst nodded quickly, almost instinctively, adjusting the slide, his movements more careful now, more precise, and the numbers on the screen remained the same, but the way they were being seen had changed completely, each line examined with a new awareness, a new attention to detail that had not been present before. Catherine slowly took a step back from the head of the table, not retreating, but repositioning, her gaze still steady. And after a brief pause, she inclined her head slightly, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but meaningful in its restraint, and then she moved to a seat along the side, her posture composed, her presence still strong, but no longer centered in the same way. The room settled into a new rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, and as the discussion resumed, it carried a different tone, one shaped not by assumption, but by clarity, by the quiet recognition of what had nearly been overlooked. Marcus listened as the analyst began again, his attention focused, his presence steady, and for a brief moment, his gaze lifted toward the glass walls where the city stretched out beyond, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, traffic moving in slow lines far below, life continuing without pause. And then he returned his attention to the table, to the room, to the work that now lay clearly before them. No one mentioned what had happened, no one revisited the moment, because they did not need to. It had already done its work, and in the quiet hum of the projector, in the soft turning of pages, in the measured voices that now filled the space, there was something else present, something subtle but undeniable, the sound of a room that had learned, in a single moment, to see more clearly than it had before.